My name is Paul Miller, and I'm the Associate Director of the Kluge Center for National Security here at UT. As I think many of you know, the Kluge Center exists to train the next generation of national security leaders, which is many of you, if you're students here at UT, benefited from the Kluge Center programs. You know that we sponsor a variety of programs to encourage the study and practice of national security affairs, including a study abroad program in London, in conjunction with King's College London. Those of you who participated in that recognize Dr. John Hughes course from that. And if you want to apply, you'll see him lecture at King's College there. We also do a variety of other things, including sponsoring some guest speakers here on campus. And so I'm happy to introduce to you today Dr. John Hughes. I do want to pause to thank the British Studies Program for co-sponsoring today's event. And while I'm talking about British things, I also want to mention that we are sponsoring a class next semester. For those of you students about to enroll in spring classes, a class next semester on Puritanism and British Civil Wars. Puritanism and British Civil Wars. So if you're interested in Puritans or British Civil Wars, please consider that class next semester. One more sort of advertisement as I begin. We're going to hear today from Dr. Hughes on his talk on the crisis of world order, a British perspective. There's already, he's adapting this talk from an article that has been published literally about 30 minutes ago in the brand new Texas National Security Review. This is a new journal that we have helped launch and send out into the world, and the website went live this morning. It went live about an hour ago, 30 minutes ago. So I encourage you to go to tnsr.org, and you can see not only a longer version of the talk that we're here today, but a variety of other articles from prominent scholars and policymakers. So we're very proud to announce the launch of TNSR to you today. So finally with that, let me introduce Dr. John Hughes. Dr. Hughes is a professor of history and foreign policy in the War Studies Department at King's College London. He's currently leading the new Grand Strategy program that he helped found there just 18 months ago. He was previously a co-director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalisation and Political Violence. Also previously held the Henry Kissinger Chair in Foreign Policy at the U.S. Library of Congress a couple of years ago. So he's a well-credentialed and experienced scholar. He's also a very prolific writer. He's the author of 5 books. Let me just mention 2 of them quickly. A few years ago he published Realpolitik, a History, which is a fascinating intellectual history of an idea, the idea of realpolitik, and how it was formed, how it's come to be understood and maybe misunderstood in more recent years. A really interesting book. And then most recently, he's the author of Citizen Clem, a biography of Clement Attlee. Of course, I have to mention that this was the winner of the Orwell Prize, the Orwell Prize for Political Writing. And if you're not familiar with that, sometimes it's said that's the equivalent, the British equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize. So happy to introduce Dr. John Hughes, the Pulitzer Prize winning author. Thank you.
Hear me? Okay, the acoustics. Excellent. Well, thank you, Paul, for that very kind introduction. Thank you to the Clement Center and all your fantastic staff again for hosting. They always get a wonderful welcome in Texas. I see all the Maymester students lined up at the back as well here to hopefully offer some supporting cheers at some point during the talk. Thank you also to the British Studies group as well at UT. I'm really delighted and honoured to address you today. I'm only sad to miss Roger Lewis, but do please send in my best, those of you who know it. I guess my work actually does exist in intersection between what might broadly be termed British studies and then also the direct interests of those involved with the Clement Center. So that means really on the one hand the study of British statecraft, British foreign policy, and then the other an interest in foreign affairs, grand strategy and national security. And that's broken down in 2 ways, as Professor Miller was saying. On the one hand, I've written sort of studies of statesmen and statecraft in the Anglo-American world. So, if you like, I had a biography of Lord Castlereagh, the kind of creator, one of the curators of the post-1815 international European order. Henry Kissinger actually wrote about it as his PhD thesis. And more recently, Clement Attlee, who was one of those present at the creation of a different type of liberal international order after 1945. But also, as well as these individuals and statesmen and statecraft and those involved in diplomacy, I've also been interested in the ideas and the worldviews that are expressed through that diplomacy, and that have been transmitted back and forth across the Atlantic. So you have moments of divergence, certainly, between Britain and America. We won't mention the War of Independence, we won't mention the War of 1812, I don't want to ruin the mood in the room, but also great moments of convergence in the 20th century in particular. Failed moments of convergence, perhaps, at the time of Woodrow Wilson's presidency, but also more successful moments of convergence in the Second World War and the building of the international order thereafter. So let me give you two health warnings before I go on to the actual texture and substance of my talk. First of all, I'm going to use this phrase, Anglo-American, rather liberally, in fact with wanton abandon over the course of my talk. Now you can challenge me on the use of that term, perhaps come back to it, and I'll hope to leave some time for questions, but I'm going to use it and I'm not going to defend it. And perhaps, you know, if you want to say there's no such thing, then we can debate that thereafter. But I will disagree with you very strongly. Second health warning is that you are my guinea pigs, if you like. I have not given this paper before. It is a shorter version of a 12,000 word essay with the new Texas National Security Review, which I encourage you all to look at. So it's a much more abridged, shorter version. So I hope you bear with me if you let me read from script on that basis. So here is my British perspective on the question of world order. The pursuit of something called world order has been an almost ever-present feature of Western, more specifically American and British, one might say Anglo-American, statecraft for at least 100 years. It is embedded in a discourse about international affairs that can be traced back at least to the late 19th century, when Britain became increasingly conscious of the fragility of its empire, and the United States began to recognise the full extent of its potential power. Now, notions of regional or indeed international order do date further back and have a central place in conceptions, particularly conceptions of European statecraft, since at least the Treaty of Westphalia. But the pursuit of world order speaks to a higher objective than the pursuit of the national interest alone, or the mere preservation of stability and security in one's neighbourhood. All versions of world order are, to some extent, aspirational and visionary. And that is, they express a wish to guide the international future, and the future is a big part of the story, towards a more desirable destination. This is obviously true of more idealized versions of world order, some of which have gone so far as to envisage a future utopia in which humanity is unified under one law, in which war is abolished and reason over violence and hatred prevails in the governance of man, seen in the work, for example, of H.G. Wells, the English socialist science fiction writer. But it also applies to more avowedly realist or anti-universalist thinking on world order, which seeks co-evolution between nation-states or great civilizational blocks as a better means, perhaps a less ambitious means, but a better means to preserve international harmony and international balance. And that you can see in the alternative version, if you like, of Henry Kissinger. Either way, however, the historical record suggests that one's view of world order is inescapable from one's worldview. It reveals the beholder's hope for how the world should or could be, rather than simply how the world is. Now, I'm not going to try and seek to establish a typology between these various definitions of world order, balance of power, if you like, on the one hand, or world state on the other, or to place them on an idealist-realist spectrum. In fact, I want to argue something different, which is that definitions are not as important, perhaps, as we think they are in the case of world order, but that the existence of world order as an aspirational idea is what really matters as a historical force in Anglo-American statecraft. So to be precise, my argument is twofold. On the one hand, the idea that a better world order was or is achievable through a combination of vision and human ingenuity has provided a higher cause, if you like, an explanatory spine to the story of Anglo-American foreign policy over the course of the last century. And it explains these moments of convergence. Secondly, therefore, and this I say with a nod to the contemporary context, when ideas of world order are simply cast out as vapid utopianism or globalist delusion, British and American foreign policy loses spirit, purpose, vision, form, and a sense of direction. Within the last decade, as is well known, a consensus has emerged in the West, or particularly in the Anglo-American world, that there is a crisis of world order and that this needs to be addressed. And strikingly, therefore, from an outsider, as I said, it's the British perspective on the world order debate, it also encompasses four of the most distinctive or influential foreign policy traditions within the United States. Those who class themselves as realists, broadly speaking, of course, are very much a contested term. Those who might be described as liberal internationalists. Those who might describe themselves alternatively as conservative internationalists. And those who are presumed to hold something like a neo-conservative perspective on foreign policy. Now, a big moment in that debate, of course, was the publication of Henry Kissinger's 2014 book, World Order, which argued, among many other things, that the reconstruction of the international system was the ultimate challenge of statesmanship in our time. But different iterations of the same theme, this concern for world order, have emerged across this political spectrum, and therefore Kissinger's book, much to the horror of Bernie Sanders, it should be said, was reviewed at length and very favourably by Hillary Clinton at the time, who spoke of a shared belief in the indispensability of continued American leadership in the service of a just and liberal order. Now, of course, Kissinger's thesis was critiqued by many from across the political spectrum. Think, for example, of Anne-Marie Slaughter, who wrote a lengthy review of the book. At the same time, even someone like Anne-Marie Slaughter concurred on one fundamental point: the urgency of creating or recreating some sort of new global order for the 21st century. And one could go, as I say, across the political spectrum to give you lots of other examples of this. I think in the same year of Kissinger's book in 2014, you had Robert Kagan's essay in the New Republic, Superpowers Don't Get to Retire. You had John Eikenberry writing in the American Interest about an assault on the progressive foundation of Pax Americana. You had Dr. Miller's book, among others, on stressing the case for a conservative internationalism, to preserve some form of world order, to make the case that world order still mattered and should not be attacked. Now, to the critics of the Washington foreign policy establishment, impugned in recent times as the blob, these concerns about a crisis of world order and a decline in American leadership are but a familiar refrain. The criticism of mainstream American foreign policy traditions and the idea that they rest on the same misguided premise about world order has manifestations both on the left, going back to the New Left of the 1960s, and also on the right. So on the left, just to give one example, you had Noam Chomsky's 1994 book, World Order is Old and New, which is really an attack on the concept of a new world order. I think more recently, more nuanced left-wing critique from Harry Anderson in two books, one on American foreign policy and its thinkers, another on hegemony, which came out just a few months ago. And more recently, the so-called Washington Consensus has come under attack from some of those associated with the Trump campaign and subsequent presidency. Most obvious, of course, in this respect, are the views of the president himself. With striking consistency over previous decades, he has expressed a worldview that is directly hostile to this idea that a world order led by the United States, in which the United States pays the price of blood and treasure to maintain, is some sort of general good. And actually, more recently, one of the more articulate criticisms of these shared assumptions of the foreign policy establishment has come from someone within the Trump administration, from Michael Anton, who's now Deputy Assistant to the President for Strategic Communications on the National Security Council. And Anton writes, nearly all opponents of President Trump's foreign policy, from conservatives and Republicans to liberals and Democrats, claim to speak for the liberal international order. A word may have been different here or there, e.g. world order, but the basic charge is always the same. Trump threatens the liberal international order. Anton went on to argue in that piece that the foreign policy establishment was lining up behind the foreign policy establishment lining up behind the liberal international order was both a kind of a priesthood and a guild. The priesthood had a vested interest in protecting its status by muddying the simple and clear and pretending that the complex is clear and obvious, but only to themselves. They dominated the language and discourse of foreign policy and were instinctively hostile to anything that challenged their received wisdom. one has to acknowledge certain elements of truth in this critique. There are indeed certain shared assumptions, presuppositions within mainstream US foreign policy traditions, the same I would say would apply to the United Kingdom as well, that have gone unchallenged or unexamined for many years. There is a distance between popular perceptions of the national interests and those prescribed by individuals within the foreign policy establishment. There are many who would agree with Anton that the attempt after the end of the Cold War to enlarge the mission in pursuit of a new world order was a case of American eyes being much bigger than our stomachs or teeth, a confusion of ideology and interest. Yet the equal reality is that this assault on the so-called priesthood rests on unexamined assumptions of its own. The purported aim of bringing the Washington Consensus crashing down, and I quote Steve Bannon on this in particular, has created an exaggerated disdain for what might be called the intellectual architecture of American grand strategy. The idea that the high premium placed on the idea of world order is some sort of globalist or neoliberal aberration tacked onto more traditional foreign policy aims by a complacent, self-interested and self-satisfied establishment is not supported by the historical record. And indeed, the breadth and the depth of the consensus across the political spectrum of what Anton rails against is ingrained so deeply precisely because so many different traditions feed into it. There's a broad consensus for solid historical and plural historical reasons. More than that, the pursuit of world order has provided an extra dimension to Anglo-American thinking about world affairs for over 100 years, providing a vision that goes beyond the pursuit of narrow self-interest, traversing the divide between so-called idealists and realists, and acting as a bridging mechanism between the immediate considerations of the nation-state and broader existential concerns, including for the very future of Western civilization. These are not post-1989 inventions. They exist at the very core of the Anglo-American worldview and have a long, if somewhat controversial, somewhat messy, somewhat tangled and confused history. Now, almost all post-1945 British prime ministers or American presidents have paid some sort of homage to the idea of an idealized version of world order. In fact, many presidents and prime ministers before 1945 have also done that. The challenge then, and this is what I want to do for the remainder of the paper, is to put this idea to test on less fertile ground. And for that reason, also for reasons of time, as I say, I expanded some of these themes at greater length in my piece. The rest of my paper takes a single freeze frame of American foreign policy thinking at a critical moment in the Cold War, in late 1969. The primary reason for starting with this episode, as opposed to one from the era of Wilson or the Roosevelts, for example, is that it sits far outside the usual idealistic lineage of American thinking about world order. Second, also, it took place in a period in which the fundamental presuppositions underlying American foreign policy were being re-examined, much as they are today. So really, it's the quote, those two quotes up there that I want to unpick, actually the second one more specifically. On the evening of the 5th of November 1969, a year to the day after his election as president, Richard Nixon was in reflective mood. At 7 p.m., he picked up the telephone on his desk at the Oval Office, on which he kept a pile of recently read books, and called Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, that they were going to discuss an interview that Kissinger was due to give with Time magazine, explaining a potential revolution in American foreign policy. Elected on a promise to end the Vietnam War, Nixon was conscious of the weight of historical responsibility on his shoulders, and he certainly felt that. He'd been reading a recently published book by the World War II veteran and University of California historian Lawrence Thompson, titled 1940, Year of Legend, Year of History. And the book told of how Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain at its darkest hour as the remnants of his nation's army fled the Nazi advance on the beaches of Dunkirk in May 1940. As Thompson wrote, it was not until Pearl Harbor, the events of Pearl Harbor, that the US was goaded into a position to replace Britain as the leading nation in defence of the West, most active Western nation on the global sphere. Assuming a responsibility of leadership which came with great grave costs in blood and treasure. Almost 3 decades later then, Nixon took charge of a country that was locked in a seemingly intractable and energy-sapping conflict in Southeast Asia. 1968, in fact, had been the bleakest year yet of the Vietnam War, with the loss of almost 17,000 American servicemen, adding urgency to this campaign promise to end the war. Yet the bleak news from Vietnam was partially alleviated by another event in Nixon's first year in office. Just a few months prior, in July 1969, 2 American astronauts, you may have heard of this, have become among the first human beings to walk the Earth's surface of the moon. And as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin disembarked Apollo 2 for their moonwalk, they had been greeted with the voice of Richard Nixon channeled through a crackling line into their earpieces. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become part of man's world, said Nixon, not usually regarded as a great idealist. And as you talk to us from the sea of tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring more peace and tranquility to earth. 3 months later then, Nixon considered how previous generations would have viewed these remarkable achievements. Back in 1901, it had been left to the English science fiction writer H.G. Wells in one of his most fantastical stories to envisage such a mission in his novel, The First Men in the Moon, which incidentally had been made into a feature film in 1964. It may have been when I was on the back of Nixon's mind, although he did refer to Wells throughout his career, as did Eisenhower, as did Churchill, as did many others. The words of Wells then in late 1969 weighed upon the president as he considered the challenge ahead. In terms of history, he said, when we talked about the crusades that H.G. Wells talked about, for example, the moon thing, he said to Kissinger, his conclusion was that nations must have great ideas or they cease to be great. More than that, Nixon feared that if America focused solely on domestic problems, which were piling up, of course, in the late 1960s, giving up on this leadership of the free world, the Western world, it would lose its sense of purpose. He said in rather classic, clunky Nixonian fashion, if we just go to the ghettos and let go of the world, apart from the destruction that might come from the war, we might destroy ourselves. Alongside this unlikely fondness for H.G. Wells, Britain's leading socialist theorists and writers, and an offender at certain points in the Soviet Union, Nixon also sought inspiration from one of his predecessors in the White House, Theodore Roosevelt, who had been president from 1911 to 1980. Roosevelt talked about this as the white man's burden, explained Nixon as he ended the phone call. Both of these people, Wells and Roosevelt, were searching for that same feeling that people need. Now, Nixon's presidency, as we all know, was to become one of the most controversial and divisive in American history. Yet in its infancy, at this crucial moment in which he's reflecting on the moon landings, reflecting on his first year in office, on the challenges at home and abroad, despite this reputation for cold-hearted realpolitik, much of which I have to say was justified thereafter, he was consciously associating himself with a cause that went beyond narrow national interest, spoke to great ideas and a civilizational crusade. This was the pursuit of world order. Now, for many then and now, the notion of a white man's burden represents the ultimate stain on the historical record of the West, which, by the way, Britain played a huge part in as well. This pretends to stand for a higher cause as a kind of a veneer masking undoubted racial prejudice and grasping self-interest, of which the British Empire is an example. If Nixon had uttered these words in public, of course, it would have likely have produced an overwhelmingly negative response. In fact, the infamous phrase was not actually Roosevelt's, for to whom he attributed it. It was actually coined by the English poet Rudyard Kipling and first used in the title of a poem written for the occasion of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, marking her 60 years on the throne. Now, the Diamond Jubilee was to symbolise the pinnacle of British imperial power, but also the growing recognition of its fragility and the loosening of the bonds that held it together. As the 19th century drew to a close, Kipling understood that the enemies of empire were growing in power and number. As the 20th century loomed on the horizon, he had also come to the conclusion that the white man's burden would be too much for Britain to bear alone for another century. It was thus at the time of the Spanish-American War in 1898 that he sought to enlist the United States in a shared endeavour to preserve and protect as much as widespread civilization in the world. Now, as you will all know, when the United States took possession of the Philippine Islands from Spain and assumed responsibility for its governance, this sparked a fierce debate as to whether a country founded on rebellion against the British Empire, which I promised not to mention, but I just slipped in there, should itself take part in an imperial game. Conscious of the way the debate was finally poised in America, Kipling, in November 1898, offered his verse directly to Roosevelt, who had just been elected governor of New York, and was a staunch supporter of expansionism. Now go in and put all the weight of your influence into hanging on permanently to the whole Philippines, he begged Roosevelt in a letter accompanying the poem. America has gone and stuck a pickaxe into the foundations of a rotten house, and she is morally bound to build the house over again from foundations, or to have it fall apart from her ears. There's a concept of world order which I still think is an idea. Forwarding Kipling's poem to Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Roosevelt commented that it was poor poetry, but it made good sense from the expansionist standpoint. Now, by evoking Wells, Kipling, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Buzz Armstrong in the space of a short phone call, Nixon clearly sought historical justification for the change in direction in American foreign policy that he was considering. And it would be easy to conclude that the president, who was not a natural intellectual, was confused by these conflicting ideas from across the political spectrum: socialist, imperialist, Britain, and America. Yet he was not amiss in seeing these overlapping Anglo-American connections. For one, there was an unlikely connection between Wells and the writing of Kipling. Even as a socialist, Wells, who rejected Kipling's imperialism in favour of his dream of a world state, acknowledged the influence the poet of empire had upon him, in particular this yearning and search for order. So to be clear, as Wells moved away from the views of his youth, he also distanced himself from Kipling and any whiff of sentimentality about empire. And in fact, In Man on the Moon, the book Nixon referred to, quoted The White Man's Burden after, was actually a critique of British imperialism published against the backdrop of the Second World War. The phrase white man's burden appears in the book, but it appears as a drunken hiccup, okay, by someone saying we must conquer the moon, it's the white man's burden. That's the response. So Wells was mocking that. And by the onset of the Second World War, Wells's vision for a new world order was one in which the empires would melt away. More specifically, he believed that a British Empire was the greatest obstacle to the unity of the English-speaking peoples. His phrase, by the way, not Churchill's, in pursuit of this higher ideal. So without stretching the point, one can see these different instincts, the Wellsian yearning for international order and the belief that it was attainable by human endeavour, and Kipling's fear about the fragility of Western civilizations in the hands of Kissinger and Nixon as they contemplated this new course in American foreign policy. There is perhaps another clue in Nixon's admiration for Winston Churchill and his reading about Churchill, because the British statesman often testified to the influence that not only Kipling had upon his language and his articulation of international affairs, but also that Wells had upon him. And in fact, some of Churchill's most famous phrases, including appeals to the unity of the English-speaking peoples, the gathering storm, or broad uplit sunlands, came directly from H.G. Wells as well. So there is a shared linguistic heritage at the very least. Nor indeed was the link between Wells and Roosevelt that Nixon made at the end of his first year in office, referring to this feeling that people need, the product of a confused imagination. It is unclear, I was unable to find any link on this, whether Nixon knew of this story or whether he had an intuitive sense that Wells and Roosevelt shared this feeling that people knew. But actually the writer and the statesman had in fact met many years before when Wells visited the White House in 1907. And on that occasion, Roosevelt had revealed to Wells a fondness for one of his earlier novels, The Time Machine, published in 1895. That book, which was influenced by the work of Charles Darwin and ideas of evolution, envisaged a future in which civilization had not evolved uniformly, but had led to the creation of a two-tiered world. On the surface of the earth lived the Eloi, peaceful, childlike, alien creatures, if you like, who had lost their evolutionary edge. they'd won in the game of evolution, but they'd forgotten things like the survival of the fittest. Okay, so they were weak, if learned, childlike creatures. With no apparent threat to their existence and having triumphed over nature through science, they were smaller, weaker, and less motivated by the quest for survival than the humans from whom they had evolved. Then, at one point, the time traveller in Wells' novel catches sight of something unsettling, called a Morlock, a queer, ape-like figure, disappearing into a subterranean network of tunnels that was once the London Underground. And it dawns upon him in the book that man had not remained one species, but had differentiated into two distinct animals, that my graceful children of the upper world were not the sole descendants of our generation, but that this bleached, obscene, nocturnal thing, which had flashed before me, was heir to all the ages. At the end of the time machine, the time traveller rushes forward in time once more to escape the Morlocks who have captured him. In a final scene, he finds a world in which all the remnants of mankind are extinct. Only the simplest vegetation remains, and monstrous crab-like features slowly scuttle along blood-red beaches in search of giant butterflies. It's a pretty scary image there, sort of civilization gone wrong. Now, for many readers of the book, this dystopian vision reflected a deep anxiety about the future of the world, a view verging on fatalistic despair. Yet this was not the case for Roosevelt, who claimed to be inspired by it. As Wells recalled, the president became gesticulatory when discussion turned to the time machine, gripping the back of a garden chair with his left hand and stabbing the air with his right as if he was speaking on a platform that Roosevelt style. His straining voice a note higher, undenying the pessimism of that book. Suppose, after all, said Roosevelt, crouching down on the White House lawn that afternoon in 1907, as if over a battlefield, said Wells. Suppose that you should be right, and it ends with your butterflies and your Morlocks. That doesn't matter now, said Roosevelt. The effort's real, it's worth going on, even then. And then Roosevelt said, Morlocks everywhere, and pretended to shoot them across the lawn of the White House. The two men both laughed. At the outset of the 20th century, Wells was pleased to report, he agreed with Roosevelt, that it was not a dystopian vision but a call to action. That Roosevelt embedded a new trend in the Anglo-American world that was altogether away from the anarchic individualism of the 19th century towards some constructive scheme. At the domestic level, the elements of this new approach could be seen in the policies of the progressive era, which obviously appealed to Wells. But the real constructive scheme that Wells had in mind was the building of a new world order. Now, it was one thing to see Roosevelt, as Wells did, as the harbinger of this constructive scheme in world affairs, and someone who was willing to reverse this trend towards anarchic individualism. It was quite another, as countless exponents of world order were to learn in the generation that followed, to articulate how such a vague idea about the future could ever be materialized or translated into diplomatic success. And the failures of Anglo-American internationalism up to and following the era of the First World War can, to a great extent, be explained by this definitional confusion. The vagueness surrounding world order, but also the competing versions of it in Britain and America. Because, of course, Britain's version of world order was one which secured a soft landing for its empire, which many Americans, of course, reacted with horror to when they saw the reality of that, still after the First World War, while still paying this fidelity to international ideas. And on the other hand, it also became clear that whatever the personal views of a Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson, someone who also was committed to a version of the world order, a new world order, that the US Congress and ergo the American people was unwilling to assume the burden that the construction of this new international order demanded. Ironically, it was outside the Anglo-American world that some observers took the view that the English-speaking peoples had missed an incredible opportunity to establish a dominant Anglo-American world order after 1980. Friedrich Meinecke, the foremost German theorist of realpolitik, addressed these questions in his classic 1924 text called Machiavellianism, the Doctrine of Raison d'Etat and its place in modern history. Meinecke refused to believe that a true League of Nations could ever be realized, and he had very little time for pretensions of Wilsonian idealism, as he saw it. Instead of the League, however, he wrote, he believed that the shared strategic culture of America and Britain, the fact that they had most of the world's naval power in their hands in particular, the fact that they supported this, a certain economic system, might eventually point to a different type of international order. While the moment had passed in 1920, Meinecke speculated 4 years later, perhaps perhaps the era of international conflict may be brought to an end, not by a genuine League of Nations, but by the world hegemony of the Anglo-Saxon powers, in whose hands the strongest physical forces of the globe are already concentrated. Meinecke did not welcome the prospect of such Pax Anglo-Saxonica, but he did recognise through the lighter touch of liberal capitalism that it would be more endurable for the individual life of other nations who sat within it, rather than dominance by the other great powers. The opportunity, of course, was not seized for a variety of reasons which are too complex to begin to explain here as I enter towards a conclusion. International order, of course, as we know, in interwar eras, for a variety of reasons, began to unravel again, and H.G. Wells reappears in our story in 1933, the year that Adolf Hitler became German Chancellor. It was in 1933 that Wells returned to these musings on the idea of world order, once again through the lens of futurology, in his book, The Shape of Things to Come. A science fiction novel also purporting to be a history of the future, it told the story of how humanity would develop from 1930 to the year 2106. The world that Wells depicted was one in which Franklin Roosevelt fails to implement the New Deal, causing a global economic crisis that lasts 30 years. This is punctuated, this is 1933 that Wells writes this, by what he calls a Second World War, that with eerie accuracy he predicts will begin in January 1940, pretty good guess, sparked by a clash between Germany and Poland over Danzig. There would be no clear victor in this war. Instead, the leading powers would emerge exhausted, and worse was to follow in 1956 with the outbreak of a plague spread by a group of enraged baboons who escaped from London Zoo that wipes out much of the world's population. He goes on. The saving of humanity would take drastic measures over many years. And in fact, Wells envisaged this saving of humanity to occur in the first instance from the emergence of a benevolent dictatorship of the air, okay, in which the leading international elites would take control of aerial power, much as those in the 19th century dominated the world through naval power. Formed by this global elite at a conference convened, the echoes of our eerie, in Basra in 1965. Through their control of the world's aircraft, they would begin by eradicating the world's religions, dropping bombs on Mecca, and waging a long war against Catholicism, which he thought would take the longest to eradicate. Eventually the dictatorship, knowing my father-in-law, who's very Catholic, I would say it's probably accurate. Eventually the dictatorship would melt away, making way for a peaceful humanitarian utopia. It was a struggle for material existence that ended, meaning that reason could finally triumph in the affairs of men. And the last recorded event in the book takes place on New Year's Day, 2106, when there's a levelling of the last skyscrapers that once dominated the New York skyline. Ultimately, of course, it was only in the heat of another world war that these threads of common language, analysis, thinking about international order began to coalesce into a new vision of the future world order by necessity, by requirement of Western populations as they were asked to fight another war. They were asked to fight it for a revolution, not only domestic but also international affairs. And in 1940, for example, a young JFK wrote that the United States ought to take our part in setting up a world order that would prevent the rise of a militaristic dictatorship, or as Churchill put it in a speech in Harvard in 1943, in which he quoted Kipling directly, "It must be world order or anarchy." Unlikely as it might seem then, there were common threads that linked together figures as diverse as Kipling and Wells, both Roosevelts, Churchill, Nixon, Kissinger, and shaped their collective worldview. The ones I haven't mentioned, of course, in my talk, which do appear in the longer article, include Arnold Toynbee, George Orwell, and others who all engaged in this debate. The first common theme was a yearning for some form of order, equilibrium, and stability, perhaps hierarchy too, it has to be said, in international affairs, or at very least, the prevention of anarchy. World order is nothing else if not the prevention of anarchy. The second was a consciousness about the fragility of Western civilization and an uncertain future in which the West's privileged position would no longer be guaranteed. You can see this again in Toynbee, Kissinger, Raymond Aron, and other thinkers. Yet to return to the fundamental point of my paper, the definition of world order matters much less than the sense in which it has been held out as the ultimate goal of Western statecraft. As H.G. Wells wrote in 1940, what was really important was not the identity of the people who pursued world order, the timeline in which it was to be achieved, or the precise definitions of world order, or even the nature of the utopia they envisaged. What mattered was the effort. No man, no group of men will ever be singled out as its father or founder. For its maker will not be this man or any man, but that being who is in some measure every one of us. Instead, world order would be like most great civilizational achievements, a social product, a collective endeavor of many lives and many years. What really mattered was that people in a century scourged by human destruction were now engaged in this collective effort. The movement must be and must remain many-headed. The new world order will be incessant. Things will never stop happening. The pursuit of world order, therefore, may indeed be a many-headed monster designed to infuriate strategists or strategic thinkers, or the vaguest of aspirations. It is right to question the assumptions behind ideas of world order, test their philosophical foundations, their internal logic, as well as the policy recommendations that arise out of them. But it would be ahistorical and self-immolating to mistake incoherence for purposelessness and abandon the venture entirely. The priesthood might deserve criticism or a kicking from time to time, but stripping the altars will not do. Thank you very much.